Hi, how you doing? So I'll run through kind of a main overview of what the bank does, how we do it, why we do it, how we conduct some of the analysis, and then how that analysis can be kind of posed into some of the YEOTY projects or give an idea that how what we do can be related back to what you do. So mainly I work in the area of labour economics, and I'll do my best to go through inflation today, but at the end I'll show how inflation can be tied into every part of it. So mainly, again, you'll probably notice from all the general curriculum for the last couple of years what the central banks do. Our main mandate is price stability, so we want to make sure that there's a general inflation target of about 2%. The main reason for this is we want to ensure that the value of the money you have today retains roughly the same value next year. So you can help plan better. You can help plan your spending, your saving, everything else. And to help achieve this, Ireland, in collaboration with the other 18 countries in the euro area that use the euro as currency, we set interest rates, and that determines the price of money. So by doing this, this does affect what banks charge their customers for the likes of loans and mortgages, and that ultimately affects what people have in their pocket at the end of the day to then go and spend for consumer items or what businesses can do for future investment and to pay their employees. So all of this has kind of a round flow in the level of inflation, but it's a kind of widely known part, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much. Mainly, so why do we do this? We want to stay away from the dangers of deflation and also stay away from the dangers of hyperinflation. So we keep this kind of 2% target. It's a nice medium target. So the danger of everyone definitely knows is a present here, and like your students are definitely going to, as Rowena said in the last presentation, this inflation is an entirely new concept to them. So the danger of this is erodes your purchasing power. If you have €100 last year, that €100 gets you far less this year. It eats into any profits that a firm has, and also affects people's, like general people, day-to-day people's parents, brothers, sisters. It affects their ability to pay back their bills. And then also inflation increases uncertainty. So we expect inflation to be persistent for the next couple of years. It's going to affect decisions that firms may make. So they may pull back on certain investments, they may pull back on certain plans. That affects the level of economic activity next year, and things might be a bit lower. Additionally as well, we've higher interest rates, higher cost of credit, so it means people are a bit more conservative in what they spend as well. And again, as Rowena said in the last presentation, persistent inflation can become embedded. So it means that if you think inflation's high this year, you'd probably have a rational reason to think it's going to be high again next year. And that leads to people going, well, if it's going to be high again next year, I'll demand a certain wage increase this year. And you have the danger of cost-plus inflation or wage price inflation. And then this kind of a box in the bottom, who are the winners and losers in this? So if you're a creditor or a saver, you're kind of in the negative category, because the value of what you're saving is worth less and less. If you're the owner of a financial asset like a bond, it's going to be worth less and less. And if you're on a fixed income or salary, so again, teachers or myself, for that reason, you're on the value of what you earn this year is going to be worth less than the value of what you earn next year. And then in terms of winners from inflation, debtors. So if you're paying back a loan, the value of what you're paying back is inflation is going to erode away that debt. And then if you hold a real asset or if you're an external asset, so if euro inflation is going up and you have stuff in dollars, it looks a bit better this year. So probably just a kind of a flow system of how this works in practice. So we'll take the recession way, and then I'll go back to what's going on at present. So if economy is in recession, the central banks make a decision to lower the interest rates. It means the price of money falls, the cost of borrowing falls, and firms and consumers are to borrow that a little bit more to carry out their general activities. So when the money is cheaper, firms have the ability to hire more workers. It's more cost competitive for them. More workers means more productivity, you have more economic growth, and then that puts an upward pressure on prices to get towards that 2% inflation target. Now, at the moment, it's kind of the complete opposite is happening. So inflation's going at 9.2%. So you definitely see in the news last couple of months, central banks are raising interest rates. That means the cost of borrowing rises. That means firms and consumers borrow less. Firms are going to be hiring less workers. So there has been some announcements for tech layoffs, and there's hiring freezes. So you might see one of the main things to keep an eye on would be unemployment rate for the next couple of months. What happens with that? So if people hire less workers, that puts a dampening effect on economic growth, and then puts a dampening effect on prices to bring it back from 9 down towards 2%. That's generally the target of what central banks plan to do. So I thought probably the best way to show this, and then if this recording is then shown to students, the best way to kind of show this is through charts. So if a picture says 1,000 words, a chart is definitely along the lines of this. And you notice on the source on the bottom, for most of this stuff is from the Central Statistics Office. I'll go through the PX stat, the resource at the very end, but generally you'll see CPM 01, CPM 15. These are the table codes you put in, and you get all the information there. It's definitely the best resource you can get for anything looking solely at Ireland anyway. Get to 2021, you have this kind of weird weather occurrence where you had an extremely cold winter and extremely hot summer. So it means there was a huge demand on energy across Europe. So you have people wanted air conditioning fuel in summer, and they wanted heating fuel in winter. So that depleted loads of reserves. And through 2020, not many people built up the reserves because we didn't use as much energy. It was cost effective to just kind of leave it at that. Also as well in 2021, there's lower supply in gas fields. Some plants are kind of off grid for a while because of maintenance costs, and there's difficulties in getting it from elsewhere. So there's a very limited area where you can get all this fuel from. And then as well, 2021 comes, you have the rollout of vaccines, and all the economies start coming back online a lot quicker than expected. So then everybody's looking for this one resource all at once in terms of fuel. And generally, since economics is the study of scarce resources, that pushes up prices completely if everyone's chasing the one thing. And then we come into 2022, you have Russian invasion of Ukraine, you have this kind of cut-off in gas availability, you have knock-on effects to pretty much every other part of the economy, and then you have the reaction of how energy prices have to come in with their pricing strategies. So you start getting all the announcements on the right-hand side from, say, RTE News ones of ESB have to increase their prices, Electric Ireland have to increase their prices, and that pushes on to people's pockets, and then they have less left over at the end of the day. So then this is all the contributions to inflation. To kind of go for Euro area, it was at 9.9, and you see all the different components of energy, food, goods and services. So of that 9.9, energy is 4.3. So huge component of why that's gone up. And then you see slight increases in food as well. And I'll come back to that one in a slide or two's time. And then other ones have been fairly consistent. Like there's been slow growth in the services, slow growth in the goods, but they are tracking up. The main one is energy. And then you want to look at where, is this unique to Ireland? Is it what's going on in other places? Ireland's probably one of the lower ones. Like it's excessive by our historical standards, but it's not. We're near the bottom of the table in terms of Europe. The likes of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, they're up around 20% because they border Russia, so they have less ability to look elsewhere for goods, and like geographic relationships play a huge role in economics. So then there's one on the food prices, and I thought given the last couple of years of YEOTY, there's definitely about 5 to 10 projects every year that mention food or sustainable food growth as a key component. So it's not just a thing of, if we can't source petrol, diesel and heating oil, it just affects home supply. There is a knock-on effect to everything else. So the one on the right-hand side is from the CSO agricultural price indexes. So the one that jumps hugely, the blue line, is fertilizer. And you can read through it all. You get sources from RTE, you can get sources from more academic places as well. A ton of fertilizer in Europe comes from one area. And it's the area where most of the conflict is. So that puts huge prices, and then you wonder if some farmer is paying double the cost for fertilizer in middle of summer this year, does he have to increase his prices next year? More than likely, yes. So you probably wonder, a potential project in YEOTY could be, what's going to happen to particular types of food? What food is fertilizer intensive, and then do we expect this to increase in price massively? And one of the good things in the CSO is you can follow very specific prices of things. Like you can get the price of cherry tomatoes and follow over 20 years. It's an incredibly nerdy thing to do, but it is very, very useful to do. So you could see, fertilizer input goes up. What happens to potato prices? What happens to strawberry prices? Does one track the movement in the entire series, or is one just completely immune? So then you can see there's the output index and the cost index, and go, well, if that gap kids get wider and wider and wider, that person is not getting much money, they're getting poorer in real terms. So, and then the one probably everyone talks about is inflation goes up, wages don't. What happens to people's earnings? And you have the whole difference of what's nominal and what's real, and one minus the other. Nominal terms, the blue line, that grew through the pandemic. There's some weird kinks in it, but they're all weird technical stuff that even we're trying to get our heads around, so we don't expect secondary school students to go into that. But I'll draw to the yellow line. It's real earnings. So real earnings have been negative since the end of last year. So then you probably wonder, okay, does that affect what people do? If you take a drop in earnings in your job now, do you start looking for a different job? Do you go to your boss and ask for a promotion? What's general people's behaviour? And that's also going to feed in through to people's decisions and what affects all inflation and economic activity next year. So then you can look at it by different sectors. And that's the chart on the right, where you have the blue bars are the nominal growth in earnings, and the little yellow dots are the real when you take away inflation. And you can look through it and find whatever sector you work in. Education went up by a bit. Real terms, it's down by about -6. Finance, that's roughly the same where I am. The only one that went up was ICT, so that's tech and computer software people. Now that's the one where the wages in that are crazy, but that's the only one that rose in real terms in the last year. So it pretty much shows everyone's more or less in the same boat. Now this can differ by job, a difference by geography, a difference by the type of contract you're on. It just kind of shows there is, just because inflation is saying 9%, it's not 9% for everybody. So I kind of wanted to show what we do and relate it to what maybe students could look at and take a bit from it is we produce a lot of economic letters that are kind of small 7 or 8 page articles. And then there's one signed article that's 20 pages, but you can pick and choose what you want from there. And then we have these QB boxes that we publish every 3 months, and they're about 2 pages. So they're really digestible. And I've purposely picked these ones because they just look at inflation or inflation's impact on something else, and they just use descriptive analysis. There's no models, there's no Greek alphabet. It's just very simple. You can pick this from the CSO and do it in Excel. And yeah, they're fairly digestible. So we do surveys with the public. We look at how this affects different people. We look at people's different expectations, and then we go, the one at the bottom, fiscal policy in high inflation environment. It sounds like a complex title, but it's just going, inflation's high. What does the government need to do, or what does the government need to do? So it's all things that someone in a Leaving Cert or Junior Cert economics cycle could take a stab at. So just I'll go through one or two of them really quickly. So this was one, we ran a survey in January, February, and March last year. And we did it with 1,300 people. And we just asked them, what do you think is going to happen over the next 12 months? We asked them, what do you think is going to happen with prices? What do you think is going to happen with activity? And what do you think is going to happen with your wages? And it's an interesting one where you think, if inflation's high, does it become embedded? You have this dark blue line. In February, everyone thinks, or 53% of people went, yeah, things are going to increase more rapidly. And then it gets to March, and that feeling becomes more embedded, and it's still 82. Now, it dips a little bit in April, but still high at 70, 73. These are all kind of showing inflation, people's expectations become a little bit more embedded. And at that time, I think it was about 6%, and the average person expected it to go up by 9 to 10, and it's at 9 at the moment. So it shows people's expectations are, they're fairly accurate. And the majority expect earnings not to keep pace with inflation. So that leads to some wage pressures. It leads to people spending less as well. A different one was another one my colleagues looked at. Is inflation the same for everybody else? I know it looks like a mess of a graph on the right hand side, but it was December of last year, inflation was 5.7. And he just wanted to look at, is that the same 5.7 for everybody? Now, if you took a secondary school example and went, hands up in the room whose family have a car. And the ones that don't, they don't spend anything on petrol or diesel. So they have, that doesn't factor into their basket of shopping every single week. Other people may have some other expenditure that someone else doesn't have. So it just shows it's not the same for everybody else. But what was found in this is the cost of living is higher for lower earning households. It's higher for older households. And it's higher for people who live in the country. And it's higher for people with children. And you probably want to go, okay, why is this? Well, it's mainly because if you're in a lower earning household, you spend more money on food and energy. You have less money to put into savings. You have less money to spend on services like, going to restaurants, going to everything else, discretionary spending. And the same if you're a rural household, you spend more on fuel because you travel further. Or your household with children, you spend more on clothing, you spend more on food. You have all these expenditures that might not be the same in different households. And this one then is a more kind of in-depth one, but it looked at, how do households cope with the cost of living? So it took a load of data from 2020 and they went 85% of people are able to meet their spending needs with either what they get month by month in their salary or just what they have in the bank. They can meet those cost commitments. But it meant that 15% of people didn't. 15% of people might need to borrow money or take up extra hours. It's in this category we call economically precarious. So this study did one part where it was, you have a baseline scenario on the table on the bottom right. If you're in a poorer household, it's 42.7% of your money is spent on essentials. So the roof over your head, fuel in the car, food on the table. And then they just went, okay, if you increase everything goes up by 2% or 5% or 10%. And this is really, really simple stuff a student can do. Like you can go get the price of potatoes off the CSO index, put a 5% increase on them and go, okay, well, what effect does that have to the person? And then you can create different scenarios. So we call this one a severe scenario. So everything goes up by X percentage. Then the people in that precarious bracket, they go from 42.7 to 46.3. That's, nearly half their money is gone on essentials. And that really, really limits to what they can do afterwards. So then thinking about maybe how to relate some of this stuff to YEOTY projects. And I wondered, I had to ask teachers during the break to go, what is being taught still? So I'll go with the assumption that C plus I plus G and X minus M is still taught. Right. Fair enough. So there is a topic of inflation and there is inflation economists and they do all sorts of incredibly complicated stuff that even I can't get my head around, but it overlaps into every single aspect of all the other stuff we look at. So you take C, you have household consumption, whatever left out at savings. So you could look at in terms of projects, if inflation goes up, how do people change their behavior? So, I can't afford this particular item. Do I just leave it or do I substitute it for a lower value item or whatever else? And in terms of savings, if people save less, what does that mean for decisions in the next couple of years? Then turning to I, you firm investment decisions and industrial competitiveness. So you have a load of inflation happening and a firm decides, okay, we're not going to build this new factory down the road. So what's the knock-on effect? You don't have those 200 jobs created in an area because of that decision. What effect does that have? Or another place that doesn't have as much inflation goes, we'll build the factory over here for you. You lose that job to maybe the US or somewhere else. What effect does that have on you? Then you go look at government spending, and again, there's a lot of complex terminology, you can, like fiscal policy and schemes and everything else, but a really tangible thing you can say is the government said they're going to give a €200 energy credit to people. Okay, so how much does that cost the government? You scale up 200 by all the households and go, is that necessary to do? What effect does it have on national debt? What effect does it have on, if the government does this with the money, what can't they do in other places, or what has to be cut? And X minus M for exports and imports, and I've lumped in labour there as well, is you have less economic activity. So what happens to an unemployment rate, or what happens to people's decisions? That we saw with the wages chart where people's wages are in negative territory. Does everybody go, I'd love to get a job in the tech sector? Does everybody switch to that? And then if everyone switches to that, what happens there? Because you have this huge rush of supply and that's going to that's good. What effect does that have on demand levels? Then if there's tons of inflation in, say, we're fairly low in European context, that we want to trade with Germany, and Germany have 10 or 12% higher than us. Do we import more or do we export more? And if the factory down the road from you goes, look, we can't afford this, we're just not going to import it, then you produce less and you have to lay off people. So there's all knock-on effects to this. As well, every single year we get about 5 projects on housing, and again, it's a hugely topical thing that's not going to go away anytime soon. So inflation goes up, the cost of bricks go up, the cost of labour goes up, the cost of everything goes up. What effect does that have on housing construction? And then do you have your usual things of, in the YEOTY projects, that people are really, really good to look at. How do you solve a housing problem? Students are really, really resourceful looking at things like this the last couple of years. And then as well, you have to increase the mortgage rates. So you go, okay, this goes up, the cost of my food goes up, the cost of my petrol goes up. What do I have to cut back on? Or potentially, how many people can't get into housing because of that increase? And then as well, I think the last couple of years we got about 10 to 15 projects on energy usage. So energy goes up, and what effect does that have on renewable energy plans and climate action? This is one that seems to be a really big occurring theme every single year, and then inflation just leads into that. So while it's talked about as like one key theme, it overlaps into so much. And then also you can use previous historical events to go, if this happened in the 1980s, what happened then could be expected to happen now? And then that's the lucky thing, you can use all the CSO data that goes back to 1926. So for YEOTY projects for 2022, so a group of us in the bank looked at these. We got about 80 projects, and we split them up into these categories. There was a lot on COVID, obviously given the year. We had a lot on health, which kind of overlapped into COVID as well. We had a lot on macroeconomics and government. Then we split a few into digital and money because there was a big obsession with cryptocurrency last year. I don't know if that may exist this year, but and then there's other ones on inequality in education. We had a lot on environment, and we had a lot on labour and housing. And then other was just a lot of really good projects that we just couldn't branch in, so accumulated them all. And the person who got other said it was actually the most interesting thing they've ever seen, because the range of everything went from, there was some on cryptocurrency, there was some on the metaverse, and there was some on the economics of Marvel films. And we even looked at these and went, these are brilliant, we want to see loads of these. But I just picked out some 5 ones. So I know there's the overall YEOTY prize and there's the central bank prize, but we're slightly biased in that if it relates to what we do, we're going to lap this up. But the one that won the overall prize last year was, is the Fair Deal scheme actually fair? And we thought that one was really good. Now, we don't have any impact on housing and any impact on Fair Deal scheme, but we just thought the way that this approached and collected data was really, really good. It went through lots of CSO data. They went and collected the data themselves. They presented a topic of, here's government policy. What's good about it? What's bad about it? What could be improved? And went, if you improve this by, I don't know, this part doesn't have to be, that doesn't have to be paid. Where can the money go somewhere else? And it was just a really, really good kind of study that way. The one we did the Central Bank Prize to last year was using economics to help ensure we map our way to the right sustainable world. So that fit in with the UNESCO Sustainable Goals category. And it just looked at, we import tons of energy from elsewhere. So if we could switch to renewables, how much money could we save? And it was a really good, practical way of just taking, we have this much imports, and just did it on an Excel table, and went, okay, we decrease this by whatever percentage every single year. Here's how much money is left over to put back into other things like health budget or a housing budget or everything else. It was just a really practical way of doing things. Now, not always entirely feasible, but it was a really clear way of presenting that you have too much dependence on something. We could reduce it. And then ones from previous years that are hyperlinked there as well. What impact do central banks and monetary policy have on inequality? Probably a relevant question again. Feasibility of cash to society. So when COVID took over, no one wanted to touch cash. And then we just have, it's tap, everything now is tap. And then pandemics and the economy, how do central banks respond? So you probably think we respond differently to high inflation than we do to a pandemic. So is there lessons in that could be used for today, for example? And then there's a number of resources. So some of these were mentioned already in Rowena's, but and I'm sure they're mentioned next in the CSO discussion as well. But PXStat is brilliant. It's like you can go in and you can create the chart to see yourself, or you can just take all the data and then plot it. They have the national accounts explained, so if you want to go, oh, what is GDP? They tell you exactly it's this and this and this minus this, and they tell you very clearly the differences. And then if you want to compare Ireland to Germany or Ireland to Lithuania, you have the Eurostat database. And then within the bank itself, we have the governor's blogs. So he produces one every 6 to 8 weeks. There's one in September that was directly addressed to secondary school students. So that's a pretty good one. We have central bank speeches. There was one this week where our deputy governor gave a speech on inflation in the labour market and how they interact. And again, these are all aimed at everyday people. We try to avoid as much like highfalutin technical language as we can. Then also we have our quarterly bulletins. That's where we get all these like 1-2 page explainers of here's something we think is interesting. How do we show it? And then also you have the Federal Reserve database for all the stuff in the US. It is quite remarkable when you type in something into that it returns a data series. There's an infinite amount of stuff in that. Vox EU is again 1 to 2 page blog post site. So everything that happens in economics in Europe, someone goes, oh, this thing happened in Greece. Does it happen somewhere else? And they just produce all these blogs. They're really easily understandable. And you have the ECB Explainer series that, again, it's like explains what GDP is, what monetary policy is. You have the ESRI publications, and you also have the DRE publications that deal with both Northern Ireland and Ireland as well. And they talk a lot about living wage and other analysis. And they also video a lot of their presentations that are easy, just 20 minutes, and I think they're kind of aimed at students. So they're a pretty good resource. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And if there's any questions or anything like that, I'd be happy to go through them. Or
I'm about to switch mortgages, so I'm going to grab it. So
lovely, yeah.
on how long it fix for. But I was interested in the survey. That was your own survey data, was it, on what people's expectations are?
Yeah.
Right. Is that then when we hear on the radio, oh, consumer confidence is at an all-time. Yeah. Is that how that's measured as well?
Yeah, so there's a couple. Bank of Ireland and AIB both do this consumer confidence index, and they pick a sample of like 2,000 people, and they just ask the same questions every single month, and they can say like it was 70% last month and now it's down to 60 based on that.
What type of things would they?
Let's see, it's 3 months and they'll say 3 months ago, yeah, I spent more because things were cheaper. At the moment I'm unsure, and in 3 months from now I expect things to be a lot higher. I'm going to spend a lot less, and then that feeds into that kind of downward trend of consumer expectations.